Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video, and today I'll be talking about the earliest vanilla version of World of Warcraft that was released to the public, patch 1.1. You see, with all this talk about what version of WoW Vanilla we should use for Classic WoW, and the fact that patch 1.1 gets brought up a lot of times, I figured it might be fun to show you guys exactly what patch 1.1 was like, and show you features that either were or weren't in the game at that time. I took all the information from Wowwiki, and if you'd like to have a look yourself, then you can find a link to the website in the video description. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's delve into what patch 1.1 was like in World of Warcraft, starting with the world environment. When it comes to the world environment, there were less flight paths. For instance, flight paths in Camp Tarajo, Ratchet and Ungoro Crater weren't there. Yeah, imagine having to go to Ungoro Crater. That would mean you'd have to fly the Gadgetzan and then travel all the way there on your mount. Oh, and before I forget, back in patch 1.1, flight paths weren't linked. So if you wanted to go to Silithus, for instance, you first had to fly the Gadgetzan, land there, talk to the flight master again, and then you were on your way to Cenarian Hold. The amount of inns was also less, as the inn at Gromgol Base Camp, for example, simply wasn't in the game yet. On top of that, there were no linked auction houses, so every auction house in the major cities had their own economy, so to say, so there was a possibility that you'd pay up the ass for a Krollblade in Orgrimmar, but find an absolute bargain somewhere else. Also, weather effects like snow in Loch Modan and Winterspring, and sandstorms in Tanaris, for example, were also not yet put in the game. One last thing I'll mention regarding the world environment is that several quest hubs we have in patch 1.12, which is the patch pretty much every vanilla private server uses, were either a fraction of what they used to be or weren't even there in the first place. A good example would be Light's Hope Chapel. In patch 1.1 there were only a few quests, there were no vendors, no guards and no inn. Alright, let's move on to raids and dungeons. Here's a quick list of dungeons and raids that were not in patch 1.1. Moradam, Dire Maul, world bosses like Azurgos or Lord Kazakh, Blackwing Lair, Zul'Gurub, Ahn'Qiraj, and of course Naxxramas. Another thing worth noting is that Scholomance and Stratholme were 10-man raids, Upper Blackrock Spire was a 50-man raid, and they took a lot longer to complete. Speaking of which, some trash mobs in Scholomance had a 5 to 6 minute respawn time. Yes, 5 to 6 minutes. You'd get into the next room, wipe, walk back, and bam, you'd run in the same trash mobs again. Also, both Scholomance and Stratholme had a lot less rare item drops. It's not that the drop chance of those items was low, they were simply not there, and the few items that did drop were much weaker, as many of the boss items were buffed in a later patch in vanilla. Now, one of the raids that was in the game was Molten Core, but there are a few things worth mentioning regarding this raid. If you've ever done Molten Core, you probably know this mob, the Son of Flame. It's a mob that needs to be taken down quickly, and while doing so it's crucial you kill the lava spawns he summons as quickly as possible. If you don't, that spawn will multiply, and then those two will multiply, and so on. Now in patch 1.12, if you don't kill them fast enough and you wipe, it's not a huge deal because they would all despawn as soon as the battle was over and you could try again. In patch 1.1, well, guess what? The adds he spawned didn't go away as soon as you wiped. They stayed there, so if you messed up on that fight, there would be tons of lava spawns you now needed to kill before being able to move on. Anyway, another thing worth noting is that in 1.1 both Ragnaros and Majordomo Executus didn't have any voices, so no cool intro before doing Ragnaros or during the boss fight. Oh, by the way, in patch 1.1, raid members did not show up on your map. So basically, if you were a raid leader trying to get everyone to the raid, you had no idea where everyone was, other than the fact that you could see what zone they're in. Not a huge deal, but admittedly kind of annoying. Alright, there's one last thing I have to talk about regarding raids, and it's a big one. The fact that back then, bosses only had 8 debuff slots. Now, this might not seem that bad for some people watching this video, but allow me to explain. If you're raiding with 40 people, you're obviously going to have 1 or 2 debuff slots for the tank, whether it's for Sunder Armor or whatever. That means that the rest of your DPS has about 6 debuff slots to go around. 6. So if you're an Affliction Warlock, too bad, you can't put all your dots on the target. Are you raiding as a hunter? Guess what? No Serpent Sting on the target, as that's usually considered a waste of a debuff slot. This basically means you are very restricted in terms of what abilities you can use, as you always want to have the best debuffs on that target. Later in the game, when Zul'Gurub was released, they upped the cap to 16 debuff slots, which definitely gave the DPS a bit more wiggle room, but before that patch it was a little bit frustrating knowing you were limited just because a boss could not have more debuffs. Then we move on to quests. Now, I think anyone who has done the attunement for Onyxia's Lair knows that that attunement quest is not exactly easy and kinda time consuming, especially for the Horde. At one point you have to go to Dustwater Marsh, talk to Emberstrife, and you'll get 3 quests. For these 3 quests you have to kill 3 elite dragons, 1 per quest, and these are scattered around the world. One is in Tanaris, one is in Winterspring, and the third one is in Swamp of Sorrows. So you can imagine getting to all of those dragons is quite a hassle and kinda time consuming, but hey, at least you were able to get all of those 3 quests at once, right? Well, yeah, in patch 1.12. In patch 1.1, you had to do these one by one. So basically, go to Dustwater Marsh to talk to Emberstrife, get 1 quest, kill that dragon, go back to Emberstrife, get the 2nd quest, kill another dragon, go back to Emberstrife, then get the 3rd quest, kill the 3rd dragon, and finally you're done with those 3. Yeah, quite the hassle, right? Another thing regarding quests is that the amazing quest lines for the Epic Priest Staff Benediction, or the Bow and Staff for the Hunter, also didn't exist. And last but not least, I gotta mention the fact that in patch 1.1 there were no quest add-ons. Nothing. Hell, not even Thoughtbot was around at patch 1.1, so there was no help whatsoever from add-ons. You had to figure out everything yourself or ask other people. And now it's time to talk about PvP. Just like dungeons and raids, there were a lot of things missing. No Warsong Gulch, no Arathi Basin, and no Elturek Valley. And yes, those were all BGs we had in vanilla, so basically there were no battlegrounds whatsoever in the earliest version of vanilla. Warsong Gulch and Elturek Valley were released in patch 1.5, which was implemented 7 months after 1.1. 7 months before World of Warcraft had battlegrounds. Oh, and if you think that's crazy, get a load of this. No PvP ranks and no PvP rewards. Yep, you heard me. Back in patch 1.1, there weren't any PvP ranks, nor was there any type of honor system in place. So basically, you were killing an enemy player for the sake of killing an enemy player. There was no incentive beyond that, as the honor system and PvP items were implemented in patch 1.4. I hope you're starting to understand just how barren and stripped down patch 1.1 was. And I'm not done yet regarding PvP. In duels you were able to change your armor set when stunned, because why the hell not? And Blizzard never saw this as a bug to begin with, so I guess this was intentional? I don't know. And the last thing I want to mention is a big one. No diminishing returns. Yes, spells like Frost Shock and Entangling Roots had no diminishing returns. So you could be a shaman and kite someone literally forever by just reapplying Frost Shock every 5 or 6 seconds. Or you could be a druid and keep someone rooted for a very long time every time you'd use Entangling Roots. And hey, back then there were no PvP rewards, so if you had no CC breaking abilities, you were shit out of luck because the PvP trinket didn't exist back then. Okay, let's move on to items, cause a lot has changed regarding items from 1.1 to 1.12 as well. First off, and I chuckled when I read this, Shadowcraft boots used to have plus 21 intellect. Yes, the dungeon set, which was considered to be for rogues, had plus 21 intellect on the boots. Luckily for them, this was later changed to agility, but it does leave you wondering, did they have Feral Druids in mind when designing this set? Was Shadowcraft supposed to be something for Feral Druids as well? I mean, it's not a bad set for Feral Druids, so maybe they did think about that when they designed the set originally. Anyway, let's move on. Green items of Holy Wrath were still in the game. The Unstoppable Force had a knockback and not a stun. You were able to use multiple flasks at once. That means Titans, Chromatic, Resistance, Supreme Power, all of those. Relics didn't exist, so no Isle of the Moon for Druids or no Totem of the Storm for Shamans. The Tier 1 set originally looked different, and in my opinion a lot more ugly than the Tier 1 we know now. And probably one of my favorite or least favorite features, no buyback. Oh yeah, if you accidentally sold an item to a vendor, tough luck. It's gone. There was no buyback tab, so you'd better be very careful with what you decided to sell to a vendor. Last but not least, gear with spell damage was much more scarce in 1.1, and items in general had different stats in 1.1 compared to later patches. Does anyone remember the Flare Core leggings and robes? They were actually quite awesome as they gave a lot of spell damage, and with the amount of fire resistance, they came in very handy in Molten Core. However, back then, these two items didn't have damage and healing, they only had extra fire damage. So you'd have robes with fire resistance with extra fire damage done. I know, quite the head scratcher, as that would mean they'd be only kinda useful for PvP, a few dungeons, and nothing else really. Anyway, that's all I have to say about items, so let's move on to the user interface. Now for the user interface, I don't have a whole lot of things to say, but there are 4 things worth mentioning here. First of all, standard raid frames we know now did not exist. So if you were in a raid with 40 people, you just had to individually click the player on the screen if you wanted to heal them, or dispel them, or whatnot. Next up, you were not able to have multiple action bars at the same time. So I guess you can only use the very basic action bar at the bottom of the screen and just cycle between them by holding shift and scrolling with the mouse wheel. Number 3 is that trading the players while they were searching the auction house would close their auction house window, so you can imagine people trolling other players with that. And number 4 is the obvious fact that there were next to no add-ons in patch 1.1. I already talked about this during questing, but I want to stress this again. This means no different unit frames, no deadly boss mods, no enemy cast bar, no nothing. Alright, let's talk about the classes. Starting with Druids. Back in patch 1.1, Druids did not have Gift of the Wild. Now, for anyone watching here that didn't know already, Gift of the Wild was something that would only give a certain group the buff in vanilla, not the entire raid. So you can imagine that being kind of annoying, but imagine not having that spell at all and having to single target people to apply Mark of the Wild in a 40-man raid. And that buff lasted 30 minutes. So enjoy your buff fest. Not only did they not have Gift of the Wild, they also didn't have Bark Skin, Swiftmant, and both Hurricane and Innervate were talents, not just skills. More importantly, Innervate as the top talent in the Resto tree, and since that spell was an absolute necessity in the very early stage of vanilla, pretty much every raiding druid had to go Resto. And that's probably the biggest reason why going as anything other than Resto was looked down upon. Furthermore, Bearform and Dire of Bearform had a lot less armor. Bearform now has a 180% armor bonus, and Dire of Bearform has a 360% armor bonus. In patch 1.1, it was 65% and 125%. That's right, you only got about a third of the armor bonus that you would get in a later stage of the game. I mean, just those two things combined were horrible for druids, and you can really see how much druids were just forced to go Resto, as in 1.1 that was pretty much the only viable option for them in terms of raiding. But hey, druids are the jack of all trades, right? If played well, they can be amazing and counter a lot of CC, right? Well, not really, because not only did they get jack in terms of armor in bear form, their shapeshift forms also didn't break any CC, nor did it counter any slowing effects. So as soon as you got rooted or sheeped as a druid, there was nothing you could do. There was no getting into caster form, putting a quick rejuvenation on yourself, getting back into travel form and running off. This type of stuff simply did not exist back then. And to top it all off, if you would get out of bear form with very low health, you would die. I'm not joking, druids get a health bonus when they shapeshift into bear form, but back then that bonus was simply cut off to such an extent that you would actually die if you didn't have enough health. So there you go, that's the druid class for you in 1.1. Let's talk about hunters next, because trust me, druids weren't the only ones who had it hard in the early stages of the game. We all know how Feign Death back then was not just used to cancel spells, it could also trick players into thinking that you were actually dead, as back then people didn't know any better. However, there was a problem, because in 1.1 your mana would still be displayed, making it a lot more obvious that a hunter used Feign Death, and thus making it a lot less useful. On top of that, players could actually resist Feign Death. Yes, you heard me, they were able to resist it. So even though you could still use it to interrupt an enemy player's cast, it could actually be resisted and he could just finish his cast no problem. Oh, by the way, this was finally changed in 1.7, 10 months after the game launched. Also, when you were in the later stage of the game, doing battlegrounds as a hunter and you were at the graveyard, you would get rest, but not your pet. So basically you had to wait to get rest, then when you were revived you had to call your pet, revive it, drink mana, because it was a very mana expensive spell back then, and then you could mount up and join the battle again. Good times, I tell you. It wasn't all bad for hunters though. Their pets were actually quite powerful, whether it was intentional or unintentional. You see, if you would order your pet to attack a rogue or a druid before he went into stealth, the pet would always chase the enemy, even if he went into stealth right afterwards. So you would just have to wait for your pet to run to him, get him out of stealth, and there you go. His opener on you is now a thing of the past. Up next on the chopping block we have priests. Just like druids, they had no prayer fortitude, so they also had to individually buff people in rage, which sucked. Holy Fire was a 5-second cast. Yes, 5 seconds for a spell that wasn't even that powerful to begin with. Switching to Shadow form would cancel out any holy buffs, so any HOTS or something similar that would be on you would simply be removed once you went into Shadow form. Oh, and as a priest you were actually able to kill players in a duel with either Mind Control or Shadow Word Pain. I'm not joking. If you had something against a fellow Horde or Alliance player, you could screw them over twice by beating them in a duel and killing them as well. Right, moving on to mages. And yes, you guessed it, Arcane Brilliance was also not in the game yet. So another class that needed a lot of time to buff up each and every one in the group. It doesn't end there though. Now in the early stages of vanilla, the boss fights in Molten Core were very long, mainly because everyone had to make do with suboptimal gear, which would later be updated. This meant that mana regenerating abilities were extremely important. But hey, mages have mage armor, right? Well, not in patch 1.1. That's right, they only had frost and ice armor, and that's it. Luckily, they did have evocation in their mana gem, but while we're on the topic of mana regeneration, they did not have level 55 conjured water or food. Yeah, the max rank of both those spells simply did not exist yet. Now any mage with a couple of greens and blues should have no problem getting about 4.5 to 5k mana. And guess what? The max rank of water they could make back then didn't even restore 3k mana. So basically, if you wanted to get full mana, you had to wait 30 seconds and drink one, and then drink another one before your full mana. I'm telling you, it was quite frustrating, and I'm glad they added some higher level water and food in the later game. So there are still more things that I like to talk about regarding the mage. First of all, the Winter's Chill talent didn't exist, and this was a pretty big deal. Allow me to explain. In WoW Vanilla, mobs in Molten Core were resistant to fire, so every mage had to go frost. What Winter's Chill did is add a debuff on the target which increases the chance of frost spells critting by 2%, and it stacked up to 5 times. So that's 10% crit chance for frost spells. 10%. That was huge back then and a major DPS increase for all the mages, but unfortunately in early vanilla it didn't exist. Last thing I want to mention is that Arcane Explosion wasn't an instant cast. Oh yeah, you ever see mages jumping around spamming Arcane Explosion to AoE mobs or to get a rogue out of stealth? Well, unless you had those talent points, you just had to stand there and actually cast Arcane Explosion. I know, it's really hard to grasp. Anyway, time to talk about one of the most powerful classes in early vanilla, the Rogue. Rogues had it easy in early vanilla, with many talents giving them insane burst damage with daggers and a hell of a lot of control. And keep in mind, back then the other classes were very limited with what they could do, so to quote Mute from World of Warcraft, winning was as easy as tapping 2 buttons. And to be fair, it really was like that. Any rogue with greens could get a 1.5k ambush crit with ease, and there were talents in place to make sure that ability was a crit most of the time. Not to mention Cold Blood and Eviscerate was a deadly combo and did a lot of damage as well, regardless of your gear. However, that doesn't mean that rogues didn't have their problems and had some things in place that did leave you scratching your head. For instance, Vanish. Now, throughout Vanilla WoW, Vanish has always been an iffy spell with it bugging out or simply not working properly. So not only did they have that issue, early Vanish did not break any root or slow effects, nor did it give you a short increased stealth bonus. It also didn't get rid of things like Hunter's Mark and Mind Vision, so it definitely was a very stripped down version of the Vanish we now know on vanilla private servers. Another thing worth mentioning is Slice and Dice, an ability which will increase your attack speed, so it's basically a buff that you apply on yourself. However, in early vanilla, this ability that, remember, you cast on yourself, would not take effect if the enemy player or mob dodged, blocked, missed, or parried this ability. Yeah, an ability you cast on yourself that can be blocked by someone else. What the hell? It's almost like trying to cast Arcane Power on your mage and it's saying you resisted it yourself. Like, what the hell were they thinking? Because I checked the logs. This wasn't a bug. This was the way it was supposed to work in patch 1.1. Another problem rogues had was that Distract didn't nearly work as well as it works now. If you were stealthing around and you saw a Shaman and you distracted them, that Distract would actually trigger a Shaman's lightning shield, damage you, and poof, you're out of stealth. Naturally, they fixed this later, but again, in the logs this is not reported as a bug fix, so there's definitely some very questionable things that they added to ship with the game way back in 2004. Alright, let's move on to another class of vanilla that was considered to be very, very powerful. The Shaman. And the main thing people kept talking about back then was just how powerful Wind Fury was. And I agree. When it hits, cause let's face it, you're always rolling the dice as an enhancement shaman, it can do massive damage, so it could take you only one swing to get your enemy down to half HP. However, back in early vanilla, it was even more powerful, because Wind Fury could proc on Wind Fury. Let that sink in for a moment. You would hit someone, get 2 extra attacks with Wind Fury, and on those 2 extra attacks, you also had the chance to proc Wind Fury. I mean, the chance of that happening was small, but when it did happen, it was a one-shot situation. And of course, it makes perfect sense they kinda dialed Wind Fury down to be more acceptable. Another thing that was really powerful back then was that Earthbind Totem did not have a cooldown. Now, as I mentioned before, Frost Shock did not have a diminishing return. So combine that with an Earthbind Totem that doesn't have a cooldown, and you're going to have a complete kite fest as a shaman. Last major thing I want to talk about, and this one is kind of messed up, is that using Reincarnation back then would get you Rest Sickness. That's right, Rest Sickness. Just like what you would get if you did that at a graveyard. So you could self-rest yourself, but do little to no damage and have next to no HP. Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to take my chances with that, and thank God they fixed that later on. So now we're going to talk about Warlocks. Like Priests, they had the ability to kill people in duels. Some of the curses they had, like Curse of Elements and Curse of Shadows, lasted only 2 minutes, so good luck applying that every 2 minutes in a boss fight. Soulstone used to cost 2 soul shards. Conflagrate was not an instant cast, and a bit of a smack in the face for Warlocks, there was no epic mount quest. They had to deal with just the regular Felsteed, while Paladins got their epic class mount right from the get-go. Other than that, there's nothing really worth mentioning apart from the fact that Death Coil worked a little different back then. In later patches, you would cast Death Coil, and as soon as it hits, you would get the health it would regenerate. In early vanilla, you got that health right after you would cast Death Coil, making it way more handy because if the target would resist Death Coil, you would at least get some healing compared to the later version of Death Coil. Other than that, the soul shards you would collect would disappear when logged out for longer than 50 minutes, which was terrible, because that meant you had to top up on soul shards every time you would log in. And that's pretty much it for the Warlocks. Compared to the other classes, they were generally speaking spared in terms of weird abilities and odd skills. Then we arrive at the Warrior. Let's start off with Berserker stance. Now today we know Berserker stance as a stance that gives you 3% crit, but also increases damage taken by 10%. In 1.1, it was actually 10% melee haste, which was quite interesting because haste was something that barely existed in WoW Vanilla, and it increased damage taken by 20%. That's right, double the amount of the later version of Berserking, which really makes you a glass cannon to some degree. Next up we have Shield Bash, which could actually be used in Berserker stance for whatever reason, and the Warrior talent Improved Hamstring, which used to increase the slowing amount the more talents you put in it, rather than having a chance to immobilize the target. And considering how important Hamstring is to players who deal damage from a distance, I'd imagine almost every warrior smacking 5 talent points to get the biggest slow on Hamstring. One last thing worth mentioning is that Death Wish did not get you out of any fear effects, nor were you able to use it while getting feared. And that's mostly it for the warrior class. And then, last but not least, we have Paladins. First up, no greater blessings. And their normal blessings lasted 5 minutes. 5 minutes before you had to buff everyone again. Can you imagine being the only Paladin in a Molten Core raid? I'm telling you, buffing everyone for 4 hours straight must have been a nightmare for every Paladin out there. Also, Paladins were another class that was really forced into going holy, as tanking was way harder than it already was. Why? Well, they didn't have the Righteous Fury skill. You know, the skill that increases threat generation from holy spells by 60%. Kind of a big deal if you ever want to tank. Well, it wasn't there, so good luck trying to tank anything when you can barely build any threat. Also, Blessing of Freedom wasn't nearly as powerful, as for some reason it did not get rid of the slow effects from Frostbolt, Cone of Cold or Frost Shock. Yeah, I guess Blessing of Freedom can get rid of everything, but when it comes to anything regarding Frost, it's powerless. They also had no Hammer of Wrath, which was definitely a powerful skill in PvP to kill off enemy players quickly once they got to low health. And last but not least, the last talent point of the old Retribution tree was Blessing of Kings. Oh yeah, one of the best blessings in the game was in a tree that barely anyone wanted to put talent points in, because pretty much every Paladin who wanted to raid had to go holy. Just what the hell, Blizzard. Well, there you have it folks, a brief overview of what things were like in the earliest stage of the live version of World of Warcraft. If you thought vanilla in itself was unbalanced, unfair and totally not optimized, I hope you now see that the most popular patch of 1.12 looks like a gift from God himself compared to the mess that was patch 1.1. Oh, and by the way, I know this is going to pop up in the comment section, but I really doubt Blizzard are going to use this build for the classic WoW servers, as I just showed you some very questionable design decisions and a lot of flaws in the classes that we had in early WoW Vanilla. I just made this video because I thought it was fun to go back to the earliest stage of Vanilla and really figure out what exactly it was like. Turns out that 1.1 is a bit of a rough diamond. A rough diamond that has been shaped into something very beautiful and memorable throughout its vanilla lifetime. And that's gonna do it for today. I hope you liked this little journey all the way back to patch 1.1. So while we're on the topic of just doing things for fun, I'd like to pose this question. Would you actually go back and play patch 1.1, or would you rather stick to the 1.12 version that every other private server sticks to? Let me know in the comment section below. As always, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.